Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Accessibility by Design webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. You may, however, unmute your line at any time by pressing 6-6, and you may mute your line again by pressing 6-3. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, you may also use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. For operator assistance at any time, please press the star followed by the 0. I would now like to turn the conference over to Paula Mahlon, Project Director, Post-Secondary Sector. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's SIIA webcast, Accessibility by Design, that is being presented by Stephanie Weeks from Blackboard. My name is Paula Mahlon, and I handle post-secondary programming for the SIIA. And I have two introductions to make. The first is to SIIA Mampandera, who's going to walk us through some of the logistics of the webcast itself. To SIIA?
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, a warm welcome from SIIA. This is to let you know that this webcast is being recorded. And again, a reminder, if you do have questions, please submit them using the chat feature. You should see that on the right-hand side of your page. And there will be various times during the presentation when you are invited to respond to questions from our speaker. So please again use the instructions provided by our operator to unmute your line, dial 6-6, and to mute your line, dial 6-3. I'd also like to invite each of you or any interested colleagues to participate in our upcoming member debrief. The Ed Division recently hosted a retreat for its new board of directors, and they've set various priorities and plans for 2011. Register online at siia.net/education to find out about our upcoming initiatives in 2011, and also for a refresher on all of the conferences, publications, events, and services that your membership enables you to participate in. So with that, I turn it back over to Paula Mahlon.
Thanks to SIIA. Before I introduce Stephanie, I wanted to give a quick commercial. This webcast is actually the first in a series to promote SIIA's new publication, The Expert's Guide to the Post-Secondary Market. It's a collection of articles from our members and education leaders covering post-secondary topics. You should all have received a link to the pre-publication sampler in preparation for this webcast, and I wanted to let you know that the full product will be in stock in March. SIIA members will be able to download a free PDF copy of the guide or purchase a hard copy for $29. Non-members can purchase hard copy for $149 and the PDF for $129. We have a schedule for the webcast dates, and they're in front of you now, but we're still working on coordinating speaker schedules, so I don't have details to share yet on who's speaking on what, but I wanted to make sure I was on your calendar. So if we want to go to the next slide, I would like to introduce Stephanie Weeks. She's Blackboard's Senior Director of User Experience, which includes functional, visual, and content design, plus usability and accessibility assessment. She loves design and its process, listening to clients, watching users, and collaborating to integrate concept into something new and enjoyable. Stephanie received her BS in Computer Science from Kennesaw State University and her MS in Computer Science from the George Washington University. And with that, Stephanie, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very excited to share with you what I have learned in working with accessibility and software, especially in the education industry. And I am also interested in hearing what questions, challenges, and ideas you all have to bring to the conversation. So I do hope that we can have some interaction in this next hour together and really learn from one another and build better software together. So I'll just start by giving you a little bit of my perspective and sort of how I've arrived here. Next slide, please. As Paula mentioned, I do work at Blackboard and have the opportunity to participate and lead the design of our education software. And it's very rewarding to be able to work with individuals who are passionate about education, employees of Blackboard, as well as work with the educators and the learners out there who really drive what we do in terms of designing functionality to enable teaching and learning, but also to learn more about what it's like, for example, to get an education with a disability. And being a member of various organizations, I've certainly discussed the topic of accessibility from different perspectives, from the product management angle, from the technical angle, from the perspective of where is the environment of technology going for individuals with disabilities. And I also include a representation here of a hobby that I personally have, which is rock climbing. I'm a member of a group called Sport Rock, and we do indoor and outdoor rock climbing. And I've actually had the opportunity to rock climb with individuals who are deaf and have lost limbs. And it's very, telling the energy that an individual will put into making the world around them work for them so that they can accomplish what they want to accomplish. And that's really what accessibility and technology is about as well. Individuals are trying to make this work for them, and we can do things to make it easier for them. So I'd like to, on the next slide here, I'd like to ask you all a question. We're going to present you with a poll. I'd love for you to respond so we can all have a sense together of what we are going through. So my question is, do you belong to an organization that has attempted to deliver an accessible product in the past, but various reasons have prevented this success? So you can just click yes or no, and all of us have either come into organizations that have attempted this before we arrived, or maybe you've been a part of the group that has attempted it. There are lots of possible reasons why it may not succeed. And so, keeping this in mind as we go through this discussion together, hopefully will remind you of some of the challenges so that we can discuss them and really, figure this out together and make sure that we can succeed in the next effort. So what we're going to discuss today, it really does, follow the article that you were provided with prior to our discussion, but it's really about how to make this happen in your organization. We know that accessibility and technology is very important. And we can go ahead and show the results as they're coming in. So over half of you are in an organization that has attempted this before. And many of you are also, have not attempted this yet, and I'm hoping the reason you're here is because you do want to do this in the near future. So that's a great mix. I'm hoping that those of you who have attempted this, you can, as we come to portions of the discussion where you've experienced similar or different occurrences, that you'll share that with the group. So what we'll talk about is, in the discussion, empowering the team. And what I mean by team is really the individuals who are responsible for tactically delivering this software and this technology, right? How are they really able to do this? We'll talk about creating a sustainable approach. Accessibility is something that has to be a part of what your company does in order to maintain accessible technology. It's not a one-time project. And so in getting off the ground, you really have to set up an approach that your company can continue to move forward with on a continual basis. We'll talk about how to, once you have that approach in place, how to move forward on new development when it's important to involve others in new development for accessibility purposes. And we'll then talk about, what about outside of product development? Who else in the company needs to be involved to make this a success, and how? And finally, we'll talk about our customers and how to ensure that they have the visibility they need that we can all be comfortable with as technology providers. So next slide. So let's talk about empowering the team. On the next slide, I have another question for you. I'd love for you all to simply respond in the chat, or if you'd like to, feel free to take yourself off mute and speak aloud, but I'm hoping we can at least get some chat going here. How many of you have been in technology, or you have technology teams, who the individuals on the team have actually witnessed what it's like for a user of your product with a disability to try to use your product? Has anyone done that before? What we did at Blackboard is, in one of our product development offsites, we actually invited an individual who on a regular basis uses Blackboard software, and we asked him to show all of us, everyone in product development, the engineers, the product managers, the designers, the QA specialists, show us all what it's like to use our product. And we, hooked up his assistive technology with, our product runs in a browser, hooked everything up for him, and he literally just sat in the room with us and showed us what it's like. And he showed us the frustrations that he was having, and he showed us areas of our products that he couldn't actually get to leverage, and what he wished he could do with the software. And we saw him and using our software, and everyone in the room immediately thought, wow, I wouldn't want to use software like that. I would want to use something better. Because everyone in the room was involved in actually developing our product, that was their main job, the thought that followed was and I could do it. I know I could give this person better software. I know I could make our technology work for this man who's trying to teach classes on Blackboard. And what we found by this, by really taking the individuals who are responsible for building and testing the software and putting them right in front of a user who is having struggle, was immediate context. So on the next slide, I have a picture here. Next slide. This is a detail of something bigger. There are some lines here. And if I were to ask you, as a team member, to do something with this, I need you to color in the lines, for example. Between the lines, color blue for me. How would you be able to do that? You wouldn't. Because in fact, what you need is the context around what are those lines? Why is it blue, and is it on the top or the bottom? Which thing is inside the line? So next slide. By providing more context, you immediately know what to color blue. You immediately know what the lines indicate, and that what we're talking about are the lakes. So context is really what I'm talking about in terms of putting the individuals who are responsible for the technology in front of someone who has a disability to see it in action. They get the context that they need, and they start being creative. They start coming up with new ideas and ways of making the software work for those users. So context is important whether you are a product manager who needs a team to build new software capabilities, and you can provide context on the market needs and what this will do for your business and what challenges individuals have out there and how we could solve their problems. The same thing applies with accessibility. Get that information to the people who are actually doing the hands-on work, and they will be more creative, and they will be thoughtful in how they approach building the software, and that's one of the really the main things that just drove our team being able to come up with creative solutions that we needed. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Obviously, that context, as I mentioned, is what the team needed, and that context is what is the key to empowering the team. Having a team read through standards and specifications is information that they probably need, they do need in fact, to know how to code and test, for example, Section 508 standards or guidelines inside a software product. But giving them context empowers them to build the right solution. Next slide, please. So here are 3 examples of how to give context. I mentioned that in my team we brought in a user and said, please show us what it's like. Another opportunity is to send individuals from the technology team to an event that's targeted for individuals with disabilities. The National Federation of the Blind, CSUN, if you literally just using a search engine, you can find events that are focused on not specific technology, but they're focused on individuals with disabilities. And those individuals all come together in a variety of events every year to discuss what technology is enabling them, what they're learning to do new, what new innovation is out there that's letting them do more. And this is, again, something that can give your team context in what the challenges are and what opportunities are out there for them to build technology that can work for your users. Another idea is to watch a disabled user use something that is well designed. That also empowers the team. It gets them very excited about knowing that it's possible, knowing you really can build software that works for everyone. An example of this is that the Yahoo or UI library online, they actually developed a series of videos that you can search for and view pretty simply, where they have a blind developer on the team who just goes through and explains what it's like for him to use a screen reader technology on the product that he developed on Yahoo. And he explains it sort of in simplistic terms, so people who've never used a screen reader or aren't really familiar with what it's like to use software as a blind person can understand it and really get their heads around it. Are there any other, again, please go ahead and use the chat. Have any of you tried doing activities like this, or can you think of other activities that come to mind that would really give this kind of context to the individuals on your team? All right, I really am going to need some more participation, folks. We'll go ahead and move on. So once your team has some empowerment, some understanding of, wow, I really need to be creative, I really need to build the solutions that users with disabilities need, internally in your group, as a business, we need to build this in a sustainable way for the business. It needs to, accessibility is not sustainable for a business when there's, a really high expense to fix a lot of bugs and hire lots of software vendors to help you and partnerships, and the cost goes up, through the roof to fix all your bugs. That's not sustainable. As a business, we know we have to be able to project our investment and understand what our return is going to be, and creating a sustainable approach for accessibility is really critical. So next slide, I ask another question. Does anyone in your organization discuss the accessibility of a workflow you're building in your product before it's coded?
And just as a reminder, it's 6-6 to unmute and 6-3 to mute.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Elle Wagner, calling from John Wiley & Sons, and we have discussed that. However, we haven't implemented anything.
Okay. And have there been any challenges in the implementation, or are you just getting started?
We're just getting started.
Okay. That's great. That is great.
Do you find that this is the best way to make files accessible?
I do, absolutely. From a business cost perspective, it's going to save you money, it's going to save you time, it's going to save rework, and it's going to save testing efforts as well. And next slide, please. What's critical about designing for accessibility is designing for everyone. Everyone, not just users with disabilities. So what we've found is that if you talk about the accessibility of a workflow before you code that feature, let's say, you start to think through, as a technology team, you start to think through, well, how will this type of individual access it? Well, how will this part of the page be structured? Well, how will you know where you are in steps 1 through 17 that it might take to complete this task? And what you start realizing as a team is, how would anyone know? How would anyone know that I need 17 steps in 25 minutes to complete this task? And why does it take me so long? How would anyone know how to get back to where they started if I'm asking this question of myself now? So what happens is that when you use accessibility as a way to really assess the feature before you code it, you realize that the design isn't as good as it could be. And it helps you find gaps in the design that lets you improve and change the design. And changing something like a static prototype or a mock-up or a sketch on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard is a lot more sustainable than changing code that's already been written by engineering teams. And so we've found that when we have, and we'll talk about this again in new development, but when we're creating a new workflow, that is the precise time to question the accessibility of the design, to discuss with customers or representatives who have firsthand knowledge of accessibility needs. And that's where we really find just incredible design opportunities to make the workflow work for everyone. Every time, every single time that we have improved a workflow or a design for a user with a disability, it's resulted in improving it for everyone. So I do absolutely, Elle, I'm glad to hear that your group is talking about doing that. So next slide. Another aspect of a sustainable approach in a technology group is technical abstraction. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you think about developing software, there's lots of code, and there are lots of similarities in various aspects of your system. For example, in Blackboard, we have a lot of features that require us to list items on a screen for users to select from. We have a lot of features that ask users to submit data, fill out forms for the system. So if you begin to abstract the features into the technical components of the system, you can actually create opportunities from a technology standpoint to really enable cost-effective improvements and corrections in the future. So what we've done with our software is we've categorized the types of screens that we use and the components that might appear on those screens. And our engineering group has actually constructed our back-end code in the same components. So, for example, at the top of all of our screens, we have what we call a breadcrumb, and it's simply stating how you got to where you are. You see this on lots of websites. A breadcrumb is a component that's been abstracted from a technical perspective. And what that means is that if we find a way to make that breadcrumb better or more accessible, or we simply have a bug, let's say, in a breadcrumb, we can fix the breadcrumb in one instance. All we do is fix the abstracted component called a breadcrumb, and every single breadcrumb throughout our application, and a rough estimate, and my application, for example, is we have over 3,000 of these. We fix one bug, and it's fixed in 3,000 locations in Blackboard. So that's what I'm talking about when I mean abstraction. In the future, you can do a lot of work on accessibility, but we build software, right? There are going to be bugs, there are going to be things that we find that we need to make better. And when the technical side has abstracted out in a way that the design side or product side can understand it, you can find those cost efficiencies. You can see, you can become aware of, aha, this bug exists here, I bet it exists everywhere else, we fix it one time, and we get to say back to our community, we have fixed this in 3,000 locations immediately for you. So it becomes very cost effective both from an engineering and a QA perspective to make those improvements and corrections. Next slide, please. Another part of sustainability that we have found is that it's really critical to integrate accessibility expertise throughout various functional groups in the organization. I have experienced being in organizations where accessibility is a department in and of itself or a group that is not integrated with the development and testing and design organizations. And I'll certainly say that there are pros and cons to each. I have found it is easier to be successful when the expertise is integrated into the group. So with our team, we have, I'll say a handful of engineers who are very, very well versed in accessibility. They can answer a question off the top of their head. They can say exactly, what a certain piece of assistive technology will, how it will respond. They are watching what's going on with, with screen readers, with screen magnifiers, etc. But that's not all of our engineers. It doesn't have to be every one of them. All of the engineers need to be aware of the context. All of the engineers need to know the best practices and coding standards. But by having a handful of them who are integrated within that engineering team, and likewise, there's a handful of QA specialists in the QA organization whose job it is, to manage quality assurance, but they are also taking the professional development opportunity to become, as expert as they can in how to test for accessibility, and likewise in design. Doing this means that the way you engineer a product considers accessibility. The way you design a product considers it. The way you test it considers it. And it becomes a more natural process. And again, it begins to, the conversation happens before the more expensive coding happens. The ideas come up earlier, reducing your change management costs. And it creates a culture of awareness so that as your company grows, as turnover occurs on the team, it doesn't have to be someone from another group coming in and telling the engineers how to change their code. It's simply how engineering happens. Has anyone else had experience? Would anyone like to share pros and cons of having a separate accessibility group versus integrating that knowledge within the functional groups? Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So once the group is integrated and best practices are in place, you certainly need to ask others to, I'll use the term loosely, test your product. So just as with lots of organizations rely on usability testing, sometimes externally and many times internally. And I really believe that the individuals who are responsible for producing the product need to also be responsible for the quality of it. How usable is it and how accessible is it? And the way that you can find that out is by asking your users. And So what we do is we actually, ask some representative users who have a variety of disabilities and use a variety of tools to use their software. We ask them to, poke around, take a look, try it out, and this is well before we are ready to make our software generally available. We do this early so that if those users find challenges, we have the opportunity to make improvements before we make our products available to the broad market. It is critical, however, if you're going to develop relationships with your users where you're asking them to spend time essentially doing somewhat of a beta test of your product, that the team who built the product already believes it works. So in my experience, it is frustrating for our customers to be able to, if they're asked to, could you spend time testing this out? I understand you use such and such assistive technology. Would you be willing to use it with our software and tell us how it works? It's okay for them to experience some challenges, some flaws, and say, it would be nice if this area behaved differently. It's a frustrating experience that they do not want to repeat if the software is completely inaccessible. So once your team believes that it's reached a pretty solid point, but there's still time to make corrections, that's the best time to ask your users to test it in their environment. Very much like the thought process behind a beta program for software releases. So, next slide, we'll move on to new development. The next slide, I have another question for you. Does your organization work with end users to get input on the level of acceptance of new features? So I see from Steve S., your group has worked with the American Foundation for the Blind to evaluate software, and they did user testing. That's fantastic. Our users are really the only ones who can tell us if it works, right? How about anyone else in the chat or on the line? Have you been working with your end users to get input on how much they accept the quality of your new features? On the next slide, I really do believe that the users of our products are our best partners. And that's true for being able to understand what changes may need to occur on features we've already released, but it's definitely true for new features. What we do in Blackboard's user experience team is we have asked a select group of individuals, they've volunteered and said, I want to make Blackboard software better, I want to help the future of teaching and learning education software, and they are willing to spend time in their environment testing things out, but more importantly, they're willing to have conversations with us in those very, very early stages. So we are exercising our description ability. An interesting exercise that I actually did with a customer who I definitely consider a partner in this endeavor is he's a blind user, and he said, well, when you come to visit me next week, why don't you bring me a screenshot of what you're thinking of and just describe it to me? So I said, okay, that'd be great. So, I sat down with him, we started to have a conversation, and I started to describe it, and I started to try my best to describe to this blind man what the software, quote, looked like. And really, it was a challenge. It takes practice to be able to describe in enough detail, without too many details, what the software is doing. It's not about the capability that's offered. It's not about the shape of the box on the screen. It's not about the color on the screen. It's about what the user is doing. And when you start to discuss what is the user doing and how does that compare to what they want to be doing, you're going to come to those fantastic moments, again, that I was speaking of before, when it's before you're coding a product, of improving the design. And, I would start to describe where the breadcrumb is, and then I would start to describe the menu, and then I would start to describe the header. And his response was, "You're on the third thing, and you're just now telling me the name of the page." Oh, that makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't that be at the top, right? So those are the kinds of conversations that we have that are so meaningful in making our designs better. So on the next slide, again, those discussions are really about how the feature works. And when you can have these conversations, every single individual is going to benefit. All of your users are going to end up with a better design, whether they have disabilities or not. And your company is going to begin producing more usable designs that your customers are going to notice. They're going to notice the attention to detail. They're going to notice the thoughtful nature of the order of things that are presented to them in the software. So if you can give your team context, if you can empower them, if you can build a sustainable approach within your development organization and work with your users even on new development, what else do you have to do? Well, it has to be more than product development to create a real culture within your organization that supports accessibility. So again, I pose a question for you. Is anyone outside of your development group knowledgeable about accessibility? I'd really love to hear from all of you. Is this conversation just happening in development, or is this outside of development for your companies? A common group that will start to bring up the topic of accessibility is a sales organization. Frequently there are sales situations where people in those seats are really asked some tough questions about the accessibility of software. Is that happening in your companies? Okay, so Benson says it's just a development conversation. That's good, that's good. Perhaps that means you're ahead of, your timing is very appropriate. You're ahead of when those tough questions are coming up in sales cycles, which means you have an advantage. You can be innovative and you can get out there before those tough questions are asked. So on the next slide, what we've found, so Joanna says, yes, your customers are requiring the accessible product. So I assume you're hearing this from your sales individuals, perhaps from your client support organization. Especially in the case where the conversation is already happening amongst customers. My belief is that anyone in your company who works with a customer or works with your product should have a basic awareness of accessibility. And that's just about everyone. So it might sound like a high bar. It might sound like, well, wow, we're even just starting to talk about this in development. We have to handle that first. What begins to happen is, as you start working on it in development, and you start bringing in users to say, help us design this correctly, we're going to have a conversation about the usability of this feature, customers start perking up their ears and start saying, what is this software organization doing? What's going on with accessibility? We hear they're investing in accessibility. We hear that they're trying to make their software more usable. We're excited about that. And more customers are going to be asking. So, most organizations that I'm familiar with, while there is a customer touch point experience that's probably happening inside development, the majority of the customer touch point is happening outside of development. It's happening with sales, with marketing, with client support. And if those people who customers talk with on a regular basis, like their account manager, their salesperson, if they have no answer, for, is your product accessible, or what do you think about accessibility, or what are you doing about accessibility? If they have no answer, if they're not able to really engage in that conversation, your company does not present as you would want it to, as one that is knowledgeable of your customers' pains and needs, and as one that is working toward fulfilling those needs. So how do you make sure, how can this happen? Next slide. What we did at our company is we began slowly but surely rolling out training opportunities for individuals in those departments. And when I mean training, I don't mean that we brought them into headquarters for a week and sat down and discussed all of this. We had webinars, we had recorded presentations, we had white papers, we had newsletters, we had blogs. It was more casually ingrained in what they were already doing, whether they were learning about what's coming up in a new release, or learning about what's the most exciting customer event that's happened lately. We were rolling it into those conversations. So here's what I suggest. In terms of building awareness of accessibility in those groups outside of development, here's what they need to know. They need to understand the experience of using your software with a disability, in general terms. They need to understand that blind users use a screen reader. They need to understand that blind users are not the only users with disabilities. They need to understand what it means to use your software with magnification, with it being read aloud, with a user needing to speak to the computer, with a user having a learning disability needing more time. There are all different types of disabilities, and there's software between the individual and your software in many, many cases. So having some general market awareness of what the situation is, what scenarios exist out there, so that they can feel comfortable engaging in a conversation with a customer about that. They need to generally be aware of assistive technologies. JAWS is a popular screen reader, Zoom is a popular screen magnifier, Dragon Naturally Speaking, et cetera, et cetera. Just, to have some, rough conversational understanding of what their customers are talking about when they say accessibility. Especially those who are involved in sales situations, they need to understand the procurement policies of your customers in regards to accessibility. So it depends on precisely what your software offers and what kind of customer you have, whether your customer is a school, a public school, a private school, a customer in Europe, a customer in the United States, the government versus a for-profit company who is providing professional development. All of these customers, consumers, have different procurement policies that apply to them. So those who are involved in making a sale to your customers need to understand how accessibility plays in. And they also need to understand whether or not that's a strict situation or a conversation. And that really enables them to have a more fluid conversation during, know how to respond to an RFP, be able to discuss with a potential customer, what they should care about. In some cases, our customers, we have found, when it comes to accessibility, many of them are incredibly knowledgeable, and we have learned so much from them. In other cases, the customer is actually not knowledgeable about what their own procurement policies are and really what it means, how to identify if the software meets those needs. What they do know is that they need to care. So, for example, a customer may come and say, gosh, I've really, I read an article about accessibility. I understand this is really, really important. Does your software do this? I'm not sure what I need to be looking into here. So those kinds of conversations are really important for your company to be able to speak to that. Training on that is very, very helpful. And then a general knowledge about issues, bugs, really, right? There are a variety. It depends on whether your product is enterprise installed, if it's a software as a service offering, a client installation, how upgrades are handled. All of these things create lots of responses for how your company responds to issues coming in. And so it's very critical that your company knows how to respond to that. So unfortunately, we're running over our time, but I'll just wrap up by proceeding a couple of slides. When it comes to customer visibility, what customers are looking for is for you to tell them what works and what doesn't work. And traditionally, software organizations we would like to explain what works and hide what doesn't work unless the customer is impacted by that, and then we will help them find a way through it. With accessibility, those users need to know what doesn't work so they can figure out how to get around it while you work on making it better. So in summary, and I'll just, if we can forward to the last slide, what we're really talking about here is creating an organization that has empathy for understanding users with disabilities, giving the teams that work on the product the context they need to be creative, and partnering with both customers and third-party vendors to help you complete your product. And by doing that, you're really going to gain more satisfied customers, more potential customers that may not have been able to buy your product because of their procurement policies before you invested. And you're going to become a company that's known for understanding the needs of your customers and delivering on that. So I hope that's been helpful. I'd certainly, again, I open the chat and line to questions or comments.
As a reminder, please press the 6 followed by the 6 if you would like to ask a question.
I believe there was an earlier question. I'll scroll up in the chat here. How does universal design for learning relate to accessibility? That is a great question. Universal design is not just applied to learning, but universal design is a great description of that aspect that I was talking about, where when you begin to think about designing for everyone and all of the situations that your software needs to support, you begin designing with what would be described as universal design. So the way that it relates to accessibility is if it's universally usable by everyone, even if it's in different ways, even if it's some people are using a browser and some people are using a screen reader and a browser, for example. If they can use it all, it's been universally designed. One, I would say, approach that some companies have taken to accessibility is not to use universal design, which is to say they will make one piece of software that serves users without disabilities and an alternative piece of software that works for, let's say, a blind user. Or sometimes that you'll see that with a particular feature in software. That is not the most sustainable approach for your company. It will in the end cost more because every time you make improvements, you have to do it twice. And so, that would not be an example of universal design. The next question is, where does legal requirement for accessibility end and good design begin? I have found that if we are truly focused on good design for everyone, we don't have to worry one bit about the legal statements and legal requirements, because the legal requirements are there to protect those who need it. And if we are designing software that's usable for everyone, then it is well designed and it's going to meet the legal requirements. I've definitely heard it said many times, and I totally agree with the statement that something can definitely be accessible without being usable. And what that means is just, Looking at the code, is the code following the standards? Check, check, check. If you're just checking a list and not looking at, can someone use this? Then that's not good design, in my opinion. And there was another question about CAST UDL guidelines, which I'm sorry to say I'm not familiar with, but thank you for bringing it up because I'm definitely going to be investigating. Are there any other questions or comments?
Again, it is the 6-6 to unmute your lines.
Okay. Then I will pass it over to Paula. Thank you all for your time.
Stephanie, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about accessibility and how to bake that into your organization. For the group, we will have a post-webcast survey, and we encourage you to complete that because, as I mentioned, we've got some more webcasts coming up, so your feedback will help guide the development of those. And of course, we make a note, January 26th will be our next webcast, and I'll let you know shortly if there's, once I know the speaker panel for that as well. We do have, for those of you who are SIIA members, we do have post-secondary sector committees and working groups, and if you're interested in becoming involved in those, as is Stephanie is, I would encourage you to reach out to me, and I'll see where we could get you more involved. And that, for the most part, wraps up our presentation for today. Thank you very much for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar. We thank you for your participation, and we ask that you disconnect your lines.